President Nixon's departure for China. South Lawn, 17 February 1972.
Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Congress and members of the Cabinet, I want to express my very deep appreciation to all of you who have come here to send us off on this historic mission. And I particularly want to express appreciation to the bipartisan leadership of the House and Senate who are here. We, of course, are under no illusions that 20 years of hostility between the People's Republic of China and the United States of America are going to be swept away by 1 week of talks that we will have there. We must recognize that the government of the People's Republic of China and the government of the United States have had great differences. We will have differences in the future. But what we must do is to find a way to see that we can have differences without being enemies in war. If we can make progress toward that goal on this trip, the world will be a much safer world, and the chance, particularly for all of those young children over there, to grow up in a world of peace will be infinitely greater. I would simply say in conclusion that if there was a postscript that I hope might be written with regard to this trip, it would be the words on the plaque which was left on the moon by our first astronauts when they landed there. We came in peace for all mankind. Thank you and goodbye.
I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Hello and welcome to the Return of the Repressed. That was Nixon talking about going to China to meet Mao Zedong, if you didn't already catch that. And I got to say, Nixon is somehow the last somewhat honest president. I mean, don't get me wrong, there is no place in hell hot or cold enough for what he did. After watching the Nixon in China doc, I watched some footage from the Hanoi bombings just to balance things out, and I started crying watching the grandmothers holding their little babies as they were crying at the sound of the bombings. No, what I mean is that he was an honest devil. What you saw is what you got somehow, and there is something almost working class about his unpolishedness. Whereas by Reagan onwards you just have actors and their sublime warish dandyism, which just treats us like stupid sheep. Anyways, what I read from this speech is that in his words, China and the USA had up until that point been at war. Not a cold war, but a war for 20 years in an unsafe world that did not know peace. Now, people who are caught up in the university discourse, and by that I don't merely mean people who are enrolled at a university or who are professional academics. I mean everybody who have an opinion on political economy without having ever been involved in experiments of political economy and organization, i.e. those for whom experience cannot prove anything. The business as usual kind of people, who only meet and choose to meet those of the same socio-economic class. Such people seems to think in a generic Aristotelian and Stoic fashion that the 20th century was a tabula rasa, a clean slate onto which competing understandings of how an economy works were allowed to project onto this open primordial surface their hypothesis, and then a natural and social reality made clear which hypotheses worked and which ones did not work. To a very limited degree, this is true. However, being guided by one's spontaneous philosophy, one might forget to analyze the actual conditions of this tabula rasa. The supposed clean slate of modern times is not and has never been a petri dish fit for experimentation. Paraphrasing Ernesto Guevara, if the conditions do not exist, we have to make the petri dish clean. Being a farmer who makes use of microbiology in improving and revitalizing the soil, I have grown a few gourmet mushrooms, but I have never been involved in a weaponized revolution. Mao Zedong and Maria Montessori, worlds and cultures apart, I admit, said that I should, in my thinking, start with such concrete experiments and then extrapolate into the abstract, not the other way around. In doing so, I know how many variables are involved in growing gourmet mushrooms, and though you might be able to buy 2 bottles of serums, one labeled Agaricus bisporus capitalismus and Agaricus bisporus communismus, the inherent materialism of those 2 substances are not the only things that will determine whether yes or no mushrooms will be successfully grown in that petri dish once it's transferred to its growing environment. My point is that the 20th century was a really dirty growing environment. Just how dirty could be explained by quickly studying the infographic on Wikipedia of the Russian Civil War after the Leninist Revolution. We have 3 major categories of directly involved belligerents. Then we have the international support of each separate group of belligerents. Every institution now mentioned can be viewed as a competing microorganism for the environment of the growing space after the petri dish of a successful socialist revolution has been transferred to it. We have among the Bolsheviks the Russian SFSR, Ukrainian SSR, Belarusian SSR, Transcaucasian SFSR, which are all different phenotypes of the Agaricus bisporus communismus that are competing for phenotypical characteristics of how the first commie button mushroom will look like. And then we have competing microorganisms that were part of the growing environment from the get-go, the dirt in the very medium, if you like. Initially, the Bolsheviks were still at war with the Central Powers, some of which in various ways continued to support anti-communist forces, primarily the White Guards of the old Russian state and republic, South Russia, Eastern Ukraine, and the provincial Priamurie government of Outer Manchuria. There were the various separatist forces of Poland, Finland, Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, supported in their turn by Sweden, Hungary, and Afghanistan, etc. In addition, various left anti-Bolshevik forces, such as the Green and Black Armies and the Kronstadt mutineers. This is in no way an episode designed to discuss the events of the Russian Civil War. What I'm trying to say is that a successful communist revolution never woke up the next day and found itself in a thriving environment. My analogy about growing gourmet mushrooms is perhaps stupid, but the stupidity is there to draw attention to the greater stupidity of assuming that capitalism and communism are 2 competing philosophical notions, allowed equal chance to prove their worth on something like a marketplace of ideas or a Greek forum of thought experiments, far removed from the reality of political economy and its inherent class struggle. The Chinese, at the beginning of the Great Leap Forward, found themselves in an even more alarming situation than the Russians. The mushrooms on their mind was of a different kind. You know, the kind that Bush Jr. and Sr. was so good to speak about in the most paranoid way possible. I personally only remember asking my parents about the metaphors of Junior. The rest came to me as a desensitized researching adult. If there were doubts about whether an anti-communist global structure was emerging in the 1920s and the 1930s, after those fateful October-November events. Then the fascist war of aggression against the Soviet Union during the 40s and the dropping of the atomic bombs had by the 50s utterly removed any such doubt. By the end of the 50s, the Chinese mainland were pretty much surrounded, with a US-backed anti-communist junta in Korea that had recently abolished the bourgeoisie democratic process under Syngman Rhee. By 1958, that country began a process of becoming a military outpost, armed with nuclear weapons, as nuclear warheads of Matador cruise missiles had arrived in both Taiwan and Osan, South Korea. The rapidly recovering satellite colony of Japan had similar geopolitical status. As it entered its high-growth era, the US-Japan security alliance was ramped up in the 1960s, initiating the establishment of permanent military bases all over the archipelago. China's relationship with India were deteriorating rapidly in a direction towards a guerrilla conflict in Tibet of 1959, with terrorists and rebels armed and organized by the CIA, the Kuomintang, and India. Subsequently, this led to what is known in China as the Sino-Indian border self-defense counterattack of the early 60s. Military support for South Vietnam by an American-led Western coalition increased in the mid-50s, and according to then Vice President Richard Nixon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had already drawn up plans to use small tactical nuclear weapons to support the French. Taiwan, too, had become a site of extreme American military activity. Recent documents released in 2021 have shown that this support was brought to the brink of nuclear war many times during the 50s. In my interview on Program to Chill, me and Jimmy discussed the great revival of American charismatic Christianity and the mass gatherings of the new end-time churches as a direct consequence of the atomic age. An uncommon insight, since the atomic age is often used today as a purely evolutionary term of where the human race finds itself in terms of technical development, much more seldom in terms of religious development. However, if what me and Jimmy suggested is accurate, and religious fervor was a social symptom of this new era by subjects in the country that had indeed used the weapon, then surely the conditions would be even more psychotic in a country on the receiving end of such aggression. I did tell a story about how I personally came to this conclusion in that interview, but I'll tell it again. At the time of Trump's inauguration and the speeches of Fire and Fury, I lived in a small village on one of the most southern peninsulas of China called Honghai Wan, the Red Sea Bay. The village was situated right next to a large nuclear power plant on the opposite side of the Taiwanese island, and as such, a possible target for a so-called tactical nuclear attack. The mental instability of Trump caused in turn tremendous mental instability in me and some other villagers, to the point that I, who was already overworked with translation contracts, became hospitalized with suicidal psychosis for more than a year. Well, I wasn't in the hospital for a year, but many months in the hospital and a very long time in bed. I will tell this story again in more human detail in an episode with less political context. However, now I tell it primarily to explain that due to this incident, I feel a certain rapport with the manic reaction of the Chinese peasants, who in the 1950s had recently become the primary target of Western imperialism in the atomic age. Let's first tell the story of these conditions in more detail, the conditions of general nuclear war, and then let's begin to talk about the various possible reactions to these conditions within the leadership of the CCP, which eventually decided on the Great Leap Forward as the only possible solution. Daniel Ellsberg, the man behind the Pentagon paper and also involved in the new 2021 Taiwan documents mentioned above, wrote a book called The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, which was released in 2017. Before he became a confessor, in 1959, Ellsberg was a strategic analyst at the RAND Corporation and a consultant to the Defense Department and the White House, specializing in problems of the command and control of nuclear weapons, nuclear war plans, and crisis decision-making. In 1961, he drafted the guidance from Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the operational plans for general nuclear war. He was a member of 2 of the 3 working groups reporting to the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, the EXCOM, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. He gives a historical background to how he came to have this job position, and how this job position became one to be held. Quote, "More problematic. In retrospect, in fact I would now say flat wrong, recklessly so, was the presumption that such communist regimes like Nazism had an insatiable appetite for expansion, which they were determined to satisfy by military aggression where necessary and feasible. In particular, it was presumed that the communist regimes in the USSR and Eastern Europe, now armed with nuclear weapons as well as superior conventional forces, posed a direct military threat to Western Europe and America, even greater than Hitler's. Moreover, the equation of communist regimes with Hitler ruled out any attempt at meaningful negotiations for the resolution of conflicts or arms control. Nothing other than full military preparedness for imminent warfare could influence or quote-unquote contain the Soviet threat to the quote-unquote free world." End of quote. We have heard this before. It is the domino effect theory, but with the nuclear twist. The plans for all-out atomic war which MacArthur sometimes is used as a scapegoat for, even though they have remained in some form until today, long after he's gone. Ellsberg first came in contact with this industrial end-time planning in the Pacific. I have cut and pasted from all chapters of his book to make a summarized, coherent story in his own words, which he explains as follows. Quote, "In every plan for war with the Soviet Union, Chinese targets, including every major city in China, were also struck. As I gathered from talking with Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Headquarters nuclear planners, there was a strong incentive for them to assume, and they did assume, that under any circumstances in which we were fighting Russia, we would also want to annihilate its communist partners, the Chinese. These maps typically did not demarcate at all between China and Russia. The Sino-Soviet bloc appeared as one giant landmass, with arrows and pins indicating the various targets. You could not tell simply by inspecting the pins whether they were in China or Russia. On some maps, local planners had pinned a piece of colored string indicating roughly the boundary between Russia and China. It was hard to imagine that such a plan could actually be carried out. Yet according to what I had already come to discover in the Pacific, and what turned out to apply worldwide, no alternative plans existed for a war involving Soviet forces on a level beyond a division or two, except for the General War Plan. And that lack was by the directive of President Eisenhower, who had decreed that there should be no plans for quote-unquote limited war with the Soviet Union, whether nuclear or conventional, under any circumstances anywhere in the world. This reflected Eisenhower's military judgment that no war between any significant forces of the United States and the Soviet Union could remain limited more than momentarily. Therefore, if such a conflict were pending, the United States should immediately go to an all-out nuclear first strike, rather than allow the Soviets to do so. On strips like Kunsan or Kadena, and on aircraft carriers surrounding the Sino-Soviet bloc in 1961, there were about 1,700 strategic air command bombers, including over 600 B-52s and 1,000 B-47s. In the bomb bays of the SAC planes were thermonuclear bombs much larger than those I had seen in Okinawa. Many were from 5 to 25 megaton in yield. Each 25 megaton bomb with 1,250 times the yield of the fission bomb that destroyed Nagasaki was the equivalent of 25 million tons of TNT, or over 12 times the total bomb tonnage we dropped in World War II. Within the arsenal there were some 500 bombs with an explosive power of 25 megatons. Each of these warheads had more firepower than all the bombs and shells exploded in all the wars of human history. A small force of B-52s was constantly airborne. Many of the rest were on alert. More than 1,000 tactical fighter bombers were armed with H-bombs in range of Russia and China. Each of them could devastate a city with one bomb. For a larger metropolitan area, it might take 2. The pre-planned targets for the whole force included, along with military sites, every city in the Soviet Union and China. There was at least one warhead allocated for every city of 25,000 people or more. Likewise, it had become public even in 1951 that General MacArthur had advised the use of atomic weapons in Korea. His recommendation to a member of Congress to do that, as well as expanding the war to China, led to his highly public and controversial firing by Truman. Eisenhower did say in his first volume of memoirs in 1963 that he had determined a decade earlier that the war in Korea could not be allowed to quote-unquote drag on, and that a conventional ground attack would be too costly. Quote within quote. First, it was obvious that if we were to go over to a major offensive, the war would have to be expanded outside of Korea. Finally, to keep the attack from being overly costly, it was clear that we would have to use atomic weapons. This necessity was suggested to me by General MacArthur, while I, as President-elect, was still living in New York. End of quote within quote. Still, I was very struck to read, when I was declassified almost 20 years later, this account of an NSC meeting early in the Eisenhower administration on February 11th, 1953. Another quote within quote. The President then expressed the view that we should consider the use of tactical atomic weapons on the Kaesong area, an area of approximately 28 square miles treated by the Truman administration as a sanctuary, as the initial site of the armistice negotiation. End of quote within quote. Vice President Richard Nixon was, as at all NSC meetings, listening and learning. He had been in office as well in 1954-55 and again in 1958, when Eisenhower directed the Joint Chiefs to plan to use nuclear weapons imminently against China if the Chinese Communists should attempt to invade the island of Quemoy, Jinmen, occupied by Chiang's troops. A few miles off mainland China, these threats, which his mentors believed to have been successful, were among the lessons Nixon sought to apply in his own presidency. As indicated at the start of this chapter, Nixon, in short, was not the first president to quote-unquote think big, nor was he the last. End of the entire quote. The first part of the book, the one of important historically documented anecdotes from a man on the inside, is telling in many ways. It is absolutely insane that a person living in an unknown city of 30,000 in the mountain jungles of Yunnan, in, let's say, outside Shangri-La, since everyone has heard of that place, would automatically be individually nuked if more than a division of 6,000 soldiers started shooting at each other at the streets of Berlin. I have been to one of the mentioned islands, called Matsu. It was once a pirate and triad island, and though beautiful, with 12,000 people, and as I recall, only one convenience store, it certainly was not worth the end of the world. Nobody could argue that it geographically belongs to Taiwan, since from the continental side you could easily build a bridge, while to Formosa the ferry took me several hours. The way Ellsberg puts it, that a single bomb of the bigger kind would have more firepower than every weapon used throughout the history of mankind, I think tells us something about how deep the valley of the shadow of death is, should one's psyche begin to walk through it. Evil is felt since the rod and staff of history, every name and face of every demon you were ever told about, be they a general of vast armies, a serial killer of insatiable bloodlust, or why not, as was the case for me, who up until that point had lived a pretty non-religious life, every name of the King of Kings that you have ever learned from any book. None of them would compare, not even collectively, to the facelessness of this end-time machine, which doesn't even recognize, either in theory or practice, human borders or markets. However, since I'm already speaking quite spiritually, let's have Ellsberg first describe to us the tactical and the strategical in the epithet of these bloated freaks of science. Quote, "The notion common to nearly all Americans that no nuclear weapon have been used since Nagasaki is mistaken. It is not the case that US nuclear weapons have simply piled up over the years, unused and unusable, save for the single function of deterring their use against us by the Soviets. Again and again, generally in secret from the American public, US nuclear weapons have been used for quite different purposes. As I noted earlier, they have been used in the precise way that a gun is used when you point it at someone's head in a direct confrontation, whether or not the trigger is pulled. For a certain type of gun owner, getting their way in such situations without having to pull the trigger is the best use of the gun. That is why they have it, why they keep it loaded and ready to hand. All American presidents since Franklin Roosevelt have acted on that motive, at times for owning nuclear weapons. The incentive to be able to threaten to initiate nuclear attacks if certain demands are not met. The long secret history of this period, extending throughout the Cold War and beyond, reveals that the assumption of a legitimate and available presidential option of first use, American initiation of nuclear attacks as an escalation of conventional armed conflict, is far more than purely symbolic or rhetorical. In reality, every president from Truman to Clinton has felt compelled at some point in his time in office, usually in great secrecy, to threaten and or discuss with the Joint Chiefs of Staff plans and preparations for possible imminent US initiation of tactical or strategic nuclear warfare in the midst of an ongoing non-nuclear conflict or crisis." End of quote. Ellsberg was cautioned against making use of the newly released documents in his books, which tells us how the gun was pointed at the head of the Chinese peasants again and again throughout the 50s. He did copy them in the 60s before a redacted version was released to the public, and in their uncensored form they concern China in particular, and as the people involved in the paper seems to argue, mankind was brought to the closest of the terminal shutdown we have ever been. Here first is a short timeline of the nuclear war events leading up to the second 5-year plan of the PRC, which will put those documents into chronological perspective. 1. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 1945, with the threat and readiness to drop more until the Japanese surrendered. Number 2. Truman's deployment of B-29s, officially described as atomic capable, to bases in Britain and Germany at the outset of the Berlin blockade, June 1948, critical in the eyes of the administration to Soviet failure to challenge the blockade in the air. Number 3. Truman's press conference warning that atomic weapons were under active consideration, as they actually were, November 30th, 1950, for Korea after China entered the war. 4. Eisenhower's secret nuclear threats against China to force and maintain a settlement in Korea in 1953. 5. Secretary of State Dulles' secret offers to French Foreign Minister Bidault of 2, possibly 3 tactical nuclear weapons in 1954 to relieve the French troops besieged by the Indo-Chinese at Dien Bien Phu. 6. Internal agreement under Eisenhower and Dulles during the first Quemoy-Jinmen crisis of September 1954, April 1955, that nuclear weapons would be necessary as a last resort to defend the offshore islands of Quemoy and Matsu, communicated to the Chinese by numerous statements by Vice President Nixon, President Eisenhower himself, and SOS Dulles, and moves that led, in Dulles' opinion, to the negotiated resolution of the crisis. Some generals and Dulles spoke about it as having, quote-unquote, tamed Mao. Number 7. Diplomatic use of the bomb, Nixon's description, to deter Soviet unilateral action against the British and French in the Suez Crisis of 1956. 8. Eisenhower's secret directive to the Joint Chiefs during the Lebanon crisis in 1958 to prepare to use nuclear weapons, if necessary, to prevent an Iraqi move into the oil fields of Kuwait. A not at all distant incident, since the 58 revolution in Iraq came about with the help of indigenous communists, which, according to the late Marxist Palestinian historian Hanna Batatu, quote, far outdistanced the other elements, at least in their organizational resources, and the direct leadership was manifest in their hands, end of quote. And he's talking there about when 500,000 Iraqi protesters demonstrated on the streets of Baghdad on August 7th, 1958. Furthermore, after the 58 revolution, China and the Soviet Union received oil for weapons from the First Iraqi Republic. The Soviet Union also agreed to give a generous loan, the equivalent of $137 million to the Quasimin government on March 16, 1959, which was to be spent within 7 years on industrial, communications, transportation, and agricultural developments and infrastructure projects. All in all, a development which led Alan Dulles to conclude that the new kingless political direction of Iraq was, quote, the most dangerous in the world, end of quote. Point number 9. Eisenhower's secret directive to the Joint Chiefs in 1958 to plan to use nuclear weapons against China if the Chinese communists attempted to invade Quemoy, Jinmen. Point number 10, the 1958-59 Berlin crisis. Point number 11, the 1961-62 Berlin crisis. We see here then that a lot can clearly happen in a decade after the Great Peace, which Ellsberg described in the following in an interview at the New York Times after the uncensored release of the documents. And I'll read to you a little bit from the interview article. While it has been known in broader strokes that United States officials considered using atomic weapons against mainland China if the crisis escalated, the pages reveal in new detail how aggressively military leaders were in pushing for authority to do so if communist forces, which had started shelling the so-called offshore islands, intensified their attacks. The nuclear dimensions of this confrontation was taken very seriously by the Eisenhower administration, and in particular the military advisors and commanders involved. Indeed, Christian Herter, who succeeded John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State, was reported to have said later, quote, the Cuban Missile Crisis is often described as the first serious nuclear crisis. Those of us who lived through the Quemoy crisis definitely regarded that as the first serious nuclear crisis, end of quote. The reason for this will be obvious every pages of this study. Among other details, the pages that the government censored in the official release of the study describe the attitude of General Lawrence S. Cutter, the top Air Force commander for the Pacific. He wanted authorization for a first-use nuclear attack on mainland China at the start of any armed conflict. To that end, he praised a plan that would start by dropping atomic bombs on Chinese airfields, but not on other targets, arguing that its relative restraint would make it harder for skeptics of nuclear warfare in the American government to block the plan. Ultimately, President Dwight D. Eisenhower pushed back against the generals and decided to rely on conventional weapons at first. But nobody wanted to enter another protracted conventional conflict like the Korean War, so there was, quote, unanimous belief that this would have to be quickly followed by nuclear strikes, unless the Chinese communists called off this operation, end of quote. And that's the end of the whole article, well, as far as I'm going to read from it. They keep on having to say that, oh, Eisenhower pushed back. Well, he didn't, did he? Because there was still a unanimous belief that if the Chinese didn't stop claiming the island, which is right out there, which is right outside their coast, yeah, they would nuke them. Now, I skimmed through the 600 pages long report, and it seems to me that the only thing keeping the generals from doing what they again and again threatened that they would do was the assumption that the Soviet Union would retaliate, since China didn't have nuclear weapons of its own at this time. But looking at it from the point of view from China, which is what we're doing today, one gigantic question hangs over this diplomatic imbalance. Could Khrushchev be trusted after his secret speech in 1956? Question mark. As we know in retrospect, the answer was no. We must keep in mind the implications of the Sino-Soviet split at the very height of the 3 years of hardship throughout this episode. One thing was, however, fundamentally clear to the CCP and Mao as they neutralized the 1958 doomsday crisis by giving up those islands right off the coast of Fuzhou. That if this was not going to happen again, China needed to be able to stand on its own legs in the new mad world. Thus, as the second five-year plan, which is the subject matter of this episode, was rolled out, construction of uranium enrichment plants in Baotou and Lanzhou began in 1958, and a plutonium facility in Jiuquan at the Lopnur nuclear test site by 1960. They needed, in short, a great leap into the atomic age.
Mother, do you think they'll drop the bomb? Mother, do you think they'll like the song? Mother, do you think they'll try to break my balls? Mother, should I build a wall? Mother, should I run for president? Mother, should I trust the government? Mama, will they put me in firing line? Is it just a waste of time? Hush now, baby, baby, don't you cry. Mama's gonna make all of your nightmares come true. Mama's gonna put all of her fears into you. Mama's gonna keep you right here under her wing. She won't let you fly, but she might let you sing. Mama's gonna keep baby cozy and warm. Mama's gonna help it.
Or do you think she's good enough? For me? Mama, do you think she's dangerous? To me? She break my heart.
Hush now, baby, baby, don't you cry. Mama's gonna check out all your girlfriends for you. Mama won't let anyone dirty get through. Mama's gonna wait up until you come in. And Mama will always find out where you've been. Mama's gonna keep baby healthy and clean. Ooh, babe. Ooh, baby, babe. Ooh, babe. You'll always be baby to me.
Mother didn't need to be so high.
History is about the past, but there is no history unless someone writes about it. But who writes history and why? The working class has no history. nor does the Chinese peasantry. They don't have the resources to write history. If we were to attempt to give them a voice, we might do well to start with the conceptualization of socialist collectivization, the most hated and most brutally misunderstood aspect of the communist hypothesis, since the days of the Paris Commune. Why? I guess ideologically because it seems to clash with individualism, which is false. But that's neither here nor there, because again, our lived reality of political economy is not a Greek forum. Thus the real reason why it is hated is because of the ownership of the means of production. Industries which are historically, as many of my dear listeners know, separately owned by a class who do not labor. And that legal structure does clash with the democratic proposal of having it belong to the laboring collective. To undertake this research, we need to do it in a way that differs from the spontaneous philosophy of the recruited intellectuals of the last episode. That is, we cannot simply compete in higher numbers and starker polemic adjectives. To tell the main story, we will have to go somewhere else, a place of more experience. Mobo Gao, who I will rely heavily upon in this episode, is a researcher from a small poor village in China called Gao, to which he returns every year from his professional position at an Australian university. He takes us back to the very early days before the proclamation of the People's Republic of China, i.e. the land reform program that was carried out in the CCP occupied areas after the surrender of the Japanese in 1945, well before Chiang Kai-shek took the nationalist government to Taiwan. Within a year or two of the redistribution of land in what were called the liberated areas, where the CCP had built their base after battling the nationalists, there were already signs of disparity between the poor and the rich. The weak and sick households began to sell their land to survive, and a new class of landlords seemed to be emerging. A familiar scenario during thousands of years of Chinese history. For a party that explicitly claimed to want to build an equal society, this was, of course, a concern for the CCP. Equally important, there was the conceptual issue of the future direction of China in the mid-1950s. One faction within the CCP leadership, represented by Liu Shaoqi, the number 2 leader in the CCP hierarchy at that time, wanted to consolidate the program of the new democratic revolution, which meant that private ownership of land should be maintained in rural China, and private entrepreneurship and patriotic capitalism should be encouraged, because such a system would motivate the development of China's economy and the employment of the urban population. Mao, on the other hand, wanted to move to the next stage of socialist development, by which land in rural China would be collectivized and industry nationalized in urban China, something he had already made clear in 1939. In the case of Liu Shaoqi, he was an old-timer in the party who had organized politically on the left since the 20s. But we should remember that there were also plenty of people like Liu, who, though part of the victorious Communist Party, might not have been communists in the strict sense of the term. This is in part due to the Comintern instruction to have the Chinese communists infiltrate the Kuomintang and turn it into a socialist revolutionary vehicle. A tricky strategy that often throughout history has worked both ways, by bringing in opportunists into the bloc that comes out on top. Finally, not all leftists think alike. If you didn't already know this, 1950s policy discussions within the CCP will soon make that very clear. For Mao, the program of the new democratic revolution had already been successfully completed by the mid-1950s, when colonialists and their compradors, the latter referring to the Chinese capitalists who moved to Hong Kong, for instance, were driven out, and the feudal system of landlord ownership was overthrown in mainland China by the land reform. For Liu Shaoqi, however, the new democratic revolution had only just started, as the CCP had only just taken over the mainland. The difference in conceptualizing the future direction of China is derived from different understandings of what the CCP took as Marx's scientific law of human history, the good old dialectical materialism. If you, like me, like to study and discuss not only the inter-party struggles of actually existing socialist countries, but also theory with a capital T in general, you know that the word dialectical materialism is sufficiently vague to produce a pretty broad spectrum of thoughts on what exactly has to be done to have history on your side, so to speak. If one was to describe things in particularly Maoist terms, we know that we are dealing with a ranking of secondary and primary contradictions, whether emphasis at a specific time should be put on changing the superstructure or the material economic base. For Liu Shaoqi, China's economic base at that time was not developed enough to change the superstructure of socialist programs of public ownership of the means of production. And therefore, it would take years of industrialization before China was ready for the next stage. This is a common strategy of procrastination for people like Trotsky, the Mensheviks, the German and Swedish Social Democrats, etc. The time is never quite ripe. This was famously, and in my opinion, best criticized by the Hungarian theorist György Lukács, who used the German word Augenblick to describe that particular moment which calls out for action and which just has to be seized. In order to do that, one needs, as Lenin put it, a heart on fire and a brain on ice. It will come as no surprise that Mao was inclined towards the role played by the cultural superstructure and its historical function. For Mao, a more advanced relationship of the means of production, that is, public ownership of those means of production, will bring more rapid economic development. After all, the CCP did not wait until China was fully industrialized to make a working class revolution, and the 1949 revolution succeeded largely due to the role played by the CCP, the vanguard of the revolution, who mobilized the Chinese peasantry rather than the urban proletariat, despite the former's backward nature, according to orthodox Marxism. In other words, Mao believed that China could march into socialism by skipping the state of capitalism under the correct leadership of the CCP. The notion of skipping might sound utterly deranged and dangerous if one thinks that the development of history is a staircase. I think I have suggested before that instead of this Microsoft's Age of Empire view of history, I favor the stochastic Markov model put forward by Paul Cockshott. I'll describe it again. Rather than a staircase made up from higher and lower stages, I ask you, dear listener, to imagine in your mind's eye a picture of a 5-pointed star. Color of such star is up to you. Now, imagine that on each of the 5 points you have 5 different types of economies, or general modes of production. They are, in the order of the staircase, clan society, a peasant economy, a slave economy, a capitalist economy, and a socialist economy. There is, even among orthodox vulgar economic theory, some dispute whether peasant or slave economy is the second position after clan society. I'll now give some examples of the arrows leading from one of these to the other that do not conform to the staircase model. A. Let's start big. What about a triple skip, if you like, i.e. a clan society never developing a predominant slave economy, nor a peasant economy, or also known as feudalism, or a capitalist economy, but transitioning directly to socialist economy. Well, that would be Mongolia, which in 1924, after breaking out of the Qing dynasty, proclaimed the Mongolian People's Republic, and thus became the second socialist state in history after the Soviet Union. B. An example of the transition from a clan society to a peasant economy is the Western European transition of Germanic tribes to feudalism in the 5th century after the Roman wars of invasion. Arguably then they overlooked an interlude of slavery that had been a part of the Roman legacy. C. However, the transition from a clan society to a slave economy, which characterizes the change in West Africa of the ancient state of Takrur on the lower Senegal River in the 13th century, did not. Skip the slave economy part. D. A peasant economy that transitioned to a socialist economy is of course our subject matter, China in 1949, after the civil war with the nationalists and the invasion war with Japan in the first half of the 20th century. Example E. But if we instead were to draw a line from a peasant economy to a capitalist, then here we have, among others, the example of the British Isles, which were some of the first peasant economies to transition to a capitalist economy in the 17th century onwards. One could argue that this was already dependent on the promises of a slave economy with the Atlantic Institution of Human Trafficking, or that the post-peasant state of affairs was a mixture of capitalist and slave modes of production. Either way, it's a problematization of the staircase model, and I will welcome such informed opinions. F. A developed capitalist economy transitioning to a socialist economy is the East German Democratic Republic, the DDR, after World War II, as they underwent their Auferstanden aus Ruinen to face the future. G. An example of a back-and-forth skip would be the Roman Republic gradually transitioning from a peasant economy to a slave economy to become the Roman Empire in the centuries before Christ. H. Later, completing this back and forth in the centuries after Christ, the Western Roman Empire would revert to a peasant economy from a slave economy. Though this was a new normal, since a republic of the classical age did not spring forth from this negation. I. Finally then, Soviet Union in the 1990s is an example of a socialist economy transitioning to a capitalist economy. We can now see that Mao, equipped with most of these examples and many more, would be right in his analysis that the law of history is more of a stochastic interplay of contradictions, rather than depending on a linear development, associated here with the orthodox Marxism of his opposition. Once the direction of collectivization was determined under such conceptualization, how to put the idea into practice mattered. In the hierarchy of the CCP, Mao was the ultimate arbitrator, and other comrades in the senior leadership looked up to him for direction. After all, the task that lay before them was immense. Not only would they have to skip hundreds of years of capitalist development in order to survive, they also had to make sure their leap would land in the age of the atomic reactor and not the steam engine. What Mao suggested was a hard pill to swallow, even for Stalinist tankies, since decentralization does not rhyme with the orthodox view of Leninism. In the area of industrial development, Mao took a strongly socialist view, concerning himself with eradicating the usual divide between the rural and the urban. Under his leadership, a strategy was developed and implemented to trial a decentralized non-Soviet form of industry program. It was proposed that the rural population could become industrialized without a need to build cities or urban ghettos, a strategy initiated during the Great Leap Forward, shelved because of the famine disaster, but picked up again during the Cultural Revolution, with success, I might add. Maybe you have sometimes wondered why Beijing is almost the only city not surrounded by shanty towns in Asia. I mean, even Osaka has a ghetto. The problem, however, was that with a long tradition of the hierarchical governance practice, which goes back thousands of years in China, which was now packaged in the name of Leninist democratic centralism. Every level of leadership looked to the level above for a performance index, but wouldn't look to the level below for an idea of what would be wrong on the ground. With the spirit of decentralization under the GLF, in part let loose by Mao, the local authorities were left to interpret their own policy priorities, while the old model was still present. We can see that this is a contradiction. Nobody had yet told them to bombard the headquarters, so the crux was that everyone seemed to guess what was wanted from a level above in the government hierarchy. And on the other hand, people were motivated to outperform the other to do what they thought was the correct understanding of the situation. As we will see, most of the concrete economic policy measures that were responsible for the people's standard of living were not designed, let alone implemented, by Mao himself. The policies of a monopoly, sale and purchase of agricultural produce, the rationing of commodities, and the grades of salaries, some implemented before the Great Leap Forward and some after, were designed by people like Chen Yun, Li Fu-chun, and Bu Yibo. The policy of squeezing the peasantry and controlling consumption was based on the Soviet model to accumulate capital for industrial development. Now I agree that sometimes you might need PPSH and T-34s rather than a vibrant retail civil society. But as we know, Mao was not happy with China's copying the Soviet model of economic development, in which everything was planned from the center. The Great Leap Forward was an attempt to find an alternative in which planning was not concentrated in Beijing. An indication of this idea is the fact that during the Great Leap Forward, all the important conferences about policies were not held in Beijing, but locally, in places like Chengzhou, Wuhan, Hangzhou, Shanghai, Nanning, etc. That Mao clearly wanted a decentralized model of development in which various levels of leadership and the broad masses of workers and farmers participated in the planning process of economic construction is also demonstrated at the 7,000 cadres meeting after the failure, which we will discuss later, which is the biggest meeting ever held in CCP history. It was largely due to the work along this direction during the Great Leap Forward and later in the Cultural Revolution that China's post-Cold War reforms were able to develop differently from those of the former Soviet Union and to succeed. Mao's strategy of a different approach was not only premised on the fact that there were not enough technical and professional experts in China when the communists took over power, though it is of course a detrimental factor that the Soviet experts left China in the tens of thousands at the end of the 50s, at the onset of the big project that is our subject matter. And with them, as we mentioned, they left China without the nuclear umbrella that had protected them. But equally important, to understand the GLF in terms of what happened and not what could have happened, as brilliantly analyzed by Schumann in 1968, Mao did not want the professional and technical elite to monopolize economic planning and management. He wanted the non-expert to lead the expert. That is, Wai Hang Ling Dao Nei Hang in Chinese. And wanted politics to control economic activities and ensure that 1. A correct political line was upheld, and 2. The masses and revolutionaries who were not experts were not marginalized in production and construction. The theoretical soundness of this can not be proven by the GLF, but would also need to consider the great proletarian cultural revolution, which I have already hinted at. And of course, whatever is going on at the time of this recording, because honestly, a weather balloon? You think that's what's really worrying the Western plutocrats and, not that painting that hangs at the entrance of the Forbidden City? Oh man, it's a good painting. Of course, to make sure that painting was hung there, Mao had to slag some of the people off in the party so that they would follow his line. Though he never shot anyone in Dallas or at the intersection of Tunnelgatan and Sveavägen, nor did he rat anyone out like they did at Watergate, and purges tended to be quite temporary. But this is not an episode about the Cultural Revolution, nor the extrajudicial killings of the people who stray from the line of the real power wielders in the West. It is about a collective of peasants trying to get out of a humiliating rut in the 1950s. Though as much as we would like not to, we need to focus on the things that went wrong. I know the subject is tricky, and I encourage you to send me letters and comments on Patreon, on Discord, or by mail if you feel I'm not being fair. Actually, try not to send me messages on Patreon. For some reason, it takes sometimes more than a month for me to see that somebody has written, and the last, 20 letters that I have answered, I had to begin the letter by saying, I'm so sorry that I didn't see your message earlier. Usually I reply like within 1 or 2 days if somebody contacts me. So, maybe better on the mail or on Discord. I should put the Discord name, I guess, in the description. Otherwise, I often hang out in the Program to Chill Discord channel or in Fergal's Kingless Generation channel, if you want to find me. And if you feel these episodes are nonetheless worthwhile, you can be reassured that I also have a lot to say about the Cultural Revolution, if you want me to. Because fortunately, after more than a decade in and out of China, those times still live fresh in the memory of people who have given me a different picture, be they Shantou taxi drivers at the KTV or Anhui peasants on the rice fields and the orchards. And though I never meant for this show to be a Maoist podcast, since I know that Hamburg cafeteria communists or Avakians, not sure if that's what they're called, can be quite, if not cunty, rather hard to talk to if you are simply wondering how to get paid properly. Thus, please let me know. Maybe we should rush to talk about glyphosate and Bill Gates, what it's like to be homeless in Stockholm or in that Osaka ghetto. The relief work I was part of in Jeollanam-do during the sinking of the MV Sevol, quietly working with ex-con murder Nazis in a car repair shop, drinking kratom with transsexual prostitutes in Kuala Lumpur, or that time I slept in a Yokudantai tour bus on the Hiroshima-Nagasaki highway, OBEs in Tibet, the ayahuasca shamaness who lived in a container out in the Taiwanese rainforests, freight train rides in Borneo and Brunei, or whatever was going through my mind when a 3-meter python hanged in the ceiling of my self-made bamboo hut, outside of which panthers fought during the jungle nights on the border of Malaysia and Thailand. Or why the fuck I stole a Buddha statue and ended up behind Korean bars during one night of custody, simply because I thought that the full moon was telling me to do so, after that old man had said something about there once having been a pretty firmly encouraged Robin Hood law amongst temples of that area. I have a lot of stories, and I'm happy to say a thing or two about them to those who wants to listen. Nonetheless, for today, let us be reminded that one of the primary reasons for the GLF failure was the establishment of overly large communes. This organizational structure contributed to the reduction of food production and therefore was a major cause of the famine. In a large commune of several thousand households, or even more in some cases, especially a commune that was formed by putting together villages of different lineages, as most of the villages were not that big, it was difficult to manage production activities. It was difficult to supervise, to monitor, and to get feedback, even with the best of intentions by everyone. The People's Commune was, contrary to common belief, not a design by either Mao or the CCP, Beijing Center. The CCP resolution on the issue in 1958 of the People's Commune was a resolution in response to what had already happened. If we again make use of our previous analogy of the zealous, spontaneous tent revivals of the end-time era in the West, We can see that this resolution was the Eastern equivalent of the party trying to manifest the voice of the Holy Ghost in order to stop the already formed people's communes from wigging out on socialism. A cap was put on the size of 6,000 households, which eventually proved to be too large as well. Furthermore, it stated that these communes should be based on 自愿自愿, that is, consent needed to be given willingly and voluntarily by the villagers before anyone organized a commune. Those already organized and those in the process of becoming should not try to alter basic production activities and management. Most importantly, the means of productions should be collectively owned, not publicly owned. And that's an important distinction. It means that what was already historically owned by the residents of any village cannot be redistributed to anyone outside of that village. It was the same with the phenomenon of public canteens, which most people have heard about today. There was no design from the top to establish public canteens. The practice emerged somewhere and was then promoted, even by leaders like Liu Shaoqi. The practice of setting up village and street stoves, making iron and steel, was not a policy from the top either, as pointed out by Zhou Enlai. Experiments of all kinds emerged at that time with political passion. This passion was reinforced by the previous successes of the CCP leadership, a passion built on belief that with the correct leadership of the CCP the Chinese masses could achieve anything. The only limitation was one's imagination. This quasi-religious belief in revolutionary change and in China's new destiny led to so many of the policies that are viewed as irrational with hindsight. Our good friend Frank de Koeter, from the last episode, having limited understanding of these social matters, being a trust fund baby in academia for his entire adult life, writes instead, quote, "Everything was collectivized. People had their work, homes, land, belongings and livelihoods taken from them. In collective canteens, food distributed by the spoonful according to merit became a weapon used to force people to follow the party's every dictate." End of quote. This New York Times best-selling phantasmagoria runs contrary to documented history, since we know that when reality hit them, the CCP leadership, especially Mao himself, quickly moved to address problems arising from having large collective communes. But by the time they realized there were issues, it was already too late, partly because some provincial authorities dragged their feet in reversing their forward policies, which needless to say had dire consequences during the El Niño event of the late 50s, when about 7% of the world's arable land was expected to feed almost a quarter of the world's population. This, however, does not mean that the communists abandoned the commune altogether, as we have mentioned. If they had, the world would look quite different. You see, the collectivization model that grew out of the trial and error of the GLF would last until the 80s, and built the infrastructure foundations of what became the greatest economic growth in human history. So, let's describe it in short before we continue with interesting origin stories of other fuck-ups that the anti-communist authors love to blame Mao for. Gao writes, "The highest administrative organ after the GLF was still called the Commune, Gongshi, under which there were 10 or so production brigades, Shengchan Dadui, and under each production brigade there were 10 or so production teams, Shengchan Xiaodui. These were the 3 layers of rural organization. The production team normally consisted of 10 to 20 households, depending on the size of the village. For instance, if a village had only 10 or 15 households, that village would have only 1 production team. Each team would have a leadership team comprising several people, a team leader, a team accountant, and a team female leader. Later in some villages, they sometimes installed a team storeman to look after the storehouse where the output of the production was kept, and a team work point record keeper. In this structure of management, A specific amount of land inherited before the 1949 revolution would be owned by all the members of the village, if the village were the size of a team, and would be managed by that team. The team would share all that was produced on the fixed amount of land. The leadership of the team arranged all of the production activities, and sometimes an ad hoc group was assigned a specific task that required a small work group. Yeah. I know what you mean by that. That's the class-aside hit squads that raped the wives of landlords and tortured children to make fertilizer. Of course, see where you're going with this. In the system, supervision and monitoring was easier and more transparent. Within one team, the contribution of each member to the collective, a man or woman, a child or a disabled person, was recorded by what was called a work point constructing China system, and everyone was supposed to do what one could. So the large communes were gone, and the principle of from each according to one's ability to each according to one's labor was upheld. At the same time, the basic amount of grain would be distributed to everyone on a per capita basis, with a difference between adult and child, irrespective of whether one could work or not, as a basic welfare provision. Here arises, of course, another common notion, the dreaded free rider phenomenon, metaphorically described as the iron bowl in Chinese, a bowl with food in that can never break, irrespective of whether one works for it. This is again more a product of the spontaneous philosophy, i.e. ideology, of bourgeoisie academics than an actual problem. I would go so far as to say that the original ancient Chinese analogy of the carrot and the whip regarding the incentives of human nature still dictates much of parental boomer thought today, be it west or east, even though we are not horses. Gao takes his own village as an example and tells us that in a lineage village where everyone was more or less related to each other, the villagers saw basic grain provision for the elderly, the sick and children as morally acceptable. They also accepted the fact that households might have ups and downs, such as more children in a particular household, and a sick person in a household 1 year but not the next. Moreover, there were other means to compensate the households that had contributed more to the team. For instance, these households might be distributed certain amounts of fish from the collective fish pond, or non-grain products such as cotton or peanuts that the households that had contributed less in terms of labor would not receive. And I'll just chip in here, because, I don't know about you, but if I was in a household, part of a work team with my brothers and my father and mother, then, of course I would make sure that my lazy fat uncle would not get as much of the collected mushrooms and the occasional wild bird that we might catch when, dinner came for, one of the holidays, birthdays, or, what have you. It's like social conditions do take care of most of these things without a boss or general or universal means of exchange. The system involved the collaborative participation of all the villagers. It was the first time in Chinese history that the rural people collectively managed their own affairs. End of quote. Anybody who is not a complete Bateman psycho agrees with this in general, but seldomly knows about the historical amount of work necessary for such a system to function, beyond the moralist arms of the church. I once went to live for a month in a small village that had refused some of the decollectivization policies of the years of contracts in the neoliberal 80s. It was a small peninsula connected by ferry to an even smaller island, all surrounded by a crawling river that almost made a whole circle, which in turn was surrounded by high, misty green mountains. It reminded me of a communist version of Rampart in Heroes of Might and Magic 3 that I played as a kid, and thus I have decided to set this anecdote to that music. Please enjoy it if you are of a similar generation. In the middle of the small village there was a big storage house with an oxblood red star above the open entrance. One section of the inside was filled to the brim with collected firewood, wild herbs and mushrooms from the surrounding area. Together with a group of old ladies in their 60s and some naughty kids, I went on one of the collecting missions that nourished the 5-point star. Along a twisting narrow path we went until we disappeared up above the seemingly constant layer of clouds that hid the peak from the village by the riverbank, where the ferryman pedaled back and forth. One night under an alabaster moon wedge I sat on a smaller hill overlooking that village, listening to Pink Floyd on my friend's iPad. As Gilmore was asking me if I could help him to carry the stone and to open my heart so that we could finally be coming home, I saw someone approaching the storage house. The hunched dark figure came out with a bundle of sticks and, to my surprise, reached its head into the small booth by the entrance, and I believe jotted down their name and the amount of what had been taken. For some reason, instead of being filled with warm joy, tremendous unexplainable vertigo overtook my being. The distance from the hill suddenly felt like light years, and if I started falling, I would fall for lifetimes. In my mind, at the tender age of the early 20s, something thoroughly snapped. However, it would take me many years before I realized what damage to the notions of the inherent competitive qualities of the human condition had been done.
在很久很久以前，你拥有我，我拥有你。在很久很久以前，你离开我，去远空翱翔。外面的世界很精彩，外面的世界很无奈。当你觉得外面的世界很精彩，我会在这里衷心的祝福你。每当夕阳西沉的时候，我总是在这里盼望你。天空中虽然飘着雨，我依然等待你的归期。每当夕阳西沉的时候，我总是在这里盼望你。天空中虽然飘着雨，我依然等待你的归期。我依然等待你的归期。我依然等待你的归期。
Returning to our investigation, simply put, it is not the case that the villain who avoids the symbolic castration of the liberal market by being fed rice even though he did not work somehow caused starvation during the 3 years of hardship. Thus when upper-class Jung Chang lets her hatred for everything collective or reminiscent of peasant life spill over, she is throughout her book not necessarily talking about the end of the 50s, socialism, or Mao Zedong, even though she goes to great length to convince her readers that that is the case. Rather, she is putting into words the return of the repressed of the warlord era, when her proto-fascist family, quote-unquote, collected art and rose to riches by extrajudicial means. Her grandfather being a general of thousands of mounted paramilitary policemen in and around Beijing. It's interesting to note that her younger friend in arms, de Koetter, uses pictures from that famine in his book on the GLF. We'll talk about this in more detail later, but here is a short taste of Chang's projections. Quote, as befitted the labor camp culture, inmates had to eat in canteens. Peasants were not only banned from eating at home, their works and stoves were smashed. Total control over food gave the state a terrifying weapon. As the canteens were sometimes hours' walk away from where people lived or worked, many tended to move to the site of the canteen. There men, women, children and old people lived like animals, crammed into whatever space was available, with no privacy or family life. When the canteens were first set up, many cadres allowed their hungry peasants to fill their stomachs. This spree only lasted a couple of months, but it hastened the onset of famine and wholesale deaths in many areas before the end of 1958. End of quote. It's very easy to laugh at Jung Chang. Her attempt at scholarship has not been well received by academics outside of the anti-communist think tank network described in the first episode. Not that she or her benefactors needs them to. She makes more money and sells more books than any of them, no matter what scholars say about her or her research methods. More importantly though, regarding collectivization, in terms of, I guess, both elementary philosophy and economics, we can conclude that there is actually nothing inherently bad about people working together. And allow me to stretch that assessment by saying that our investigation has begun to prove that there are bad and good, productive and unproductive forms of collectivization. Again, this is a point which can only be fully proven by diving into the decades after the GLF. But I hope everyone can agree that if it was inherently wrong, then how come it was put to successful use again only a few years later, when Mao had regained his pathos? I mean, nobody can seriously believe that if tens of millions of people died as a direct cause of collectivization, that it would be put into use again. No matter how monstrous you make Mao to look, nobody has that level of hypnotic cunningness to convince tens of thousands of organizers and billions of subjects to be pissed upon and told that it's raining if they have just been pissed upon. Now, even if we don't use the Maoist model or China in the past 40 years, we have in terms of quote-unquote planned economy, for example, though it's not much talked about, the corporate syndicates such as Samsung, LG, Asus, etc. of junta-controlled Korea and Taiwan, who based their dragon or tiger miracles, whatever they are called, on Stalinist Soviet 5-year plans, and the heavy industry planned economy that beat the Nazis. I think it's fun, you know, like sometimes when you talk to people who are like staunch libertarians, they always ask you, like, when you are like discrediting capitalism in one way or another, and they always go like, yes, but you have an iPhone and you know, like, and then there's some story about what's his face, Paul Rudd. It's not Paul Rudd, it's Scott Paul. No, it's not Scott Paul either, Marcus. Paul Scott? No. Fuck. Steve Jobs. Yes, that's right. It's Steve Jobs. And then there's some story about like how Steve Jobs, you know, worked so diligently, you know, to make it all happen. And, you know, like how can we criticize capitalism if we at the same time, make use of his product? I'm always wondering, like, first off, like, why don't they turn that argument around? Do they think that everybody who buys apples knows about Steve Jobs? Like, that before you buy the phone, you have to read the little red book of Steve Jobs and his biography and be like in agreement philosophically before you're allowed to have it. And furthermore, don't they know that, again, these are made in China, again, according to planned economy? That's what makes sure, that they don't have to, what would you have to pay for a smartphone if it was made by some artisanal guild in your own hometown? Like, you would have hundreds of thousands, well, in renminbi, but in tens of thousands in dollars probably is what you would have to pay. But yeah, never mind that. That belongs to another discussion. But I might also add that in terms of steel production, minus the much talked about pig iron, which honestly that's the most racist comment ever when people bring that up, as if the people who invented steel don't know how it works. Yeah, I mean, and even minus this, the Great Leap Forward saw a doubling of the national production from 57 to 59, as well as from 58 to 60. And though that industrial tendency, which is, hard to find elsewhere in history, was only temporary, it never dropped down to numbers before the project was initiated. And those are numbers I found from, Australian heavy industry, who have always made a buck selling their ore to just about anyone. Unfortunately, though, I'm starting to sound alarmingly economically vulgar. I would much rather talk about ecological consequences of forced industrialization in general, present both during the GLF and the Cultural Revolution, and of course every other capitalist economic miracle during the 20th century. However, it seems that to prove a point about individual property rights, whatever that might actually mean in a world of the value form, one has to use the gross national product jargon of the enemy. Again, the successes of the proletarian revolution cannot and should not be estimated with these tools, but that's for a future possible episode, if you will have me. Even so, we must continue our investigation for the things that nonetheless went wrong and forced the communes to become too big, so that we can learn from the experiment. Two things are often discussed when talking about the GLF: the inner party struggle between the Maoists and their opposition, as well as the outer party struggle, let's say, more commonly known as the anti-rightist movement of 1957, the Fan Yo Yundong, being the aftermath of the 100 Flowers campaign. The anti-rightist movement certainly created an atmosphere of leftist political correctness, though obviously not of the liberal versus conservative kind that we know today, which predominantly concerns itself with the interpellation of interpassivity and discussion on M&M outfits and other ridiculously important issues. And other ridiculously important cultural issues, rather than questioning things like in how many years will we be able to surpass the heavy industry of Great Britain and the Victorian legacy that still rules in Hong Kong.
It seems to me that there's a segment that we've been remiss in ignoring for a long time now on the show. We used to do it much more regularly. It's called Deconstructing the Culture. So, it is time once again to deconstruct the culture, where we take an important piece of popular culture and we break it down for its important aspects in American life. So, let's deconstruct a little bit of culture.
By the way, is Shapiro reading Derrida? Seems a bit postmodern and culturally Marxist, but maybe they realized it works. Never mind that. We know that out of these struggles, Mao came out on top and held the key to the conceptual direction that dictated the GLF policies. However, to say that Mao held the main positions of responsibility is not to say that Mao alone should be held responsible for the GLF disaster, nor should Mao be held responsible for everything that happened at grassroots levels all over the country. As soon as a general line, which involved decentralization, was put forward, it was up to everyone to interpret it and make it happen. Which means that rather than using Mao as a scapegoat, we must continue to look for a policy process in the CCP system that led to the disaster of the GLF. This was, once upon a time, a more common practice among bog-standard academic scholars in the 80s and 90s, such as David Bachman and Frederick Thios, who are certainly not Maoists, before these structuralist topics became the stuff of pop cultural gore stories. If we do that, we will see that Liu Shaoqi and others, like Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai, not only fell into line with Mao, but actively supported the GLF. According to Yang Shangkun's diary entries in early 1959, and Yang Shangkun is one of the first promoters of the economic reform after Mao died, which he might have not been the same as whatever Deng Xiaoping cooked up, but since he was kind of tried to make it according to the NEP of Lenin, well, that's how he excused it anyway. Deng Xiaoping, Chen Yun, and Li Fuchun, the three heavyweights in the implementation of the policies, were the ones who insisted on fulfilling the centrally planned industrial production targets. It was Ke Xingshi, the one who was accused of being a puppet dog of Mao by the post-Mao elite, who wanted to slow down. Liu Shaoqi, the second in command, a man with a reputation for being practical, went as far as to say on December 20th, 1957, that it would only take China 2 or 3 years to overtake Great Britain, which is the first indication of how high the Holy Ghost of socialism was already flying to breathe before things started jumping. Even the term leap forward might be an invention by the person who was initially criticized by Mao for being too cautious, that is, Zhou Enlai, despite his mighty good looks, I might add. I always thought of him and his facial features as an rather handsome Asian Beckett. Maybe that's why Kissinger and Nixon liked talking to him so much. Wang Li, one of the old-timers who lasted into the mid-90s, says that during a talk in Wuhan in July 1963, in the presence of Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, Peng Zhen, Kang Sheng, Shen Buda, Wu Lengqi, Yao Qin, Fan Luoyu, and Wang Li, Mao said that he saw the term Great Leap in newspapers in Beijing in September 1957 when he was with Deng Xiaoping in Moscow, and thought the slogan was quote-unquote anti-materialist. That means really bad in commie circles. Wang further claims that he remembered Wu Lengqi, the editor of the People's Daily, transmitting Mao's criticism of the communist wind, referring here to the political correctness of limiting private space for the development of communism as early as October in 1957. The editor of the People's Daily regrets himself in his memoirs that he did not follow Mao in his criticism, but instead supported the frenzy as head of the CCP media outlet. A similar story can be found regarding the idea of people's communes, which was first implemented by the Chaishan local authorities in Suiping County of Henan province in April 1958. When Mao was introduced to the idea by Tan Xilong, the party secretary of Shandong province, Mao made an offhand remark that the people's commune, quote-unquote, sounded good. A journalist picked up the remark and made headline news in the People's Daily that, quote, Chairman Mao said people communes is good, end of quote. If we continue with the famous idea of everyone eating together in a canteen, then this was again an experiment initiated by the local authorities. On July 8, 1958, the People's Daily published a report that listed 8 advantages of setting up a public canteen, including the promotion of work efficiency and liberation of women from the kitchen. In theory, a great thing, and I personally was never fundamentally worried about, for example, Catholic private schools today, since even if they taught that humans lived alongside dinosaurs, the battle of socialism, I think, would still have been won as long as kids, be eating lunch collectively together without paying for it. And, by that I mean undertaking the ritual of handing over general means of exchange in exchange for food. I know somebody ultimately pays for it, or grows the food. The idea of the canteens was reported to be supported by Liu Shaoqi when he visited Shandong on July 14 to 18, 1958, when he also suggested that every factory should make their own iron and steel instead of relying on external supplies. In other words, backyard furnaces were not Mao's invention, nor did they come about because of Mao's order. In fact, as even US emigres like Li Zhisui, who made a pension by writing The Private Life of Chairman Mao in 1994, has to admit that Mao was very skeptical and kept on asking, if backyard furnaces were so good, why do foreign countries have big iron and steel plants instead? Now, me bringing this up is not a critique of small medium-scale industry, but petty bourgeois household industry. Now, just where exactly that line is drawn was one of the lessons of modernity first learned during the GLF. That is, if one does not trust wholeheartedly in the models of Andrew Carnegie and Baroness Margaret, as one is laid off in the Rust Belt, Yorkshire Country, West or North Europe, etc. You might recall how Danny felt about that in Brass Off.
This band behind me will tell you that that trophy means more to me than out else in the whole world. But they'd be wrong. Truth is, I thought it mattered. I thought that music mattered. But does it bollocks? Not compared to how people matter. Us winning this trophy won't mean bugger all to most people, but us refusing it, like what we're going to do now, well, then it becomes news, doesn't it? You see what I mean? That way I'll not just be talking to myself, will I? Because over the last 10 years, this bloody government has systematically destroyed an entire industry. Our industry. And not just our industry. Our communities, our homes, our lives. All in the name of progress, and for a few lousy bob. I'll tell you something else you might not know as well. A fortnight ago, this band's pit were closed. Another 1,000 men lost their jobs. And that's not all they lost. Most of them lost the will to win a while ago. A few of them even lost the will to fight. But when it comes to losing the will to live, to breathe, point is, if this lot was seals or whales, you'd all be up in bloody arms, but they're not, are they? No, they're not. They're just ordinary, common and garden, honest, decent human beings, and not one of them with an ounce of bloody hope left. Oh, aye. They can knock out a bloody good tune. But what the fuck does that matter? Now I'm going to take my boys out onto the town. Thank you.
I give the Islanders a hard time on this show, but you know I love the real ones of you lot. It's all good. You know where the true faults lie. Anyways, the same month, 1958, Li Fuchun and Li Xiannian, two leaders in charge of the state's central planning, in their, quote, outlines for the second five-year plan, end of quote, stated that it would take no more than 2 or 3 years for China to overtake Britain in industry, and that increase in agricultural production would be as high as 35%. Bu Yibo, another main player in central planning, gave a report on June 17, 1958, titled, quote, Overtaking the UK in 2 years, end of quote, which is the same time frame given by Liu Shaoqi, which we mentioned earlier. If one wants to get noided on Liu Shaoqi, there is ample room to do so. You see, it is not only our mentioned anti-communist writers who want to blame Mao for the Great Leap. The post-Mao official line is also that the Great Leap Forward famine was all Mao's fault. Which of course begs the question, what supposed truths do they think they are digging for, or revealing? Fuck all is the answer. They are just translating what the revisionists have been saying since the man was embalmed. To prove this, it is rewarding to study how Chinese authorities work to make sure publications follow what is allowed officially via the inclusion or exclusion in selected volumes of important CCP leaders' speeches. During the 1980s, speeches of Liu Shaoqi was collected into volumes for publication. However, none of Liu's speeches made between June 1958 and the summer of 1960, a gap of 2 years, were included in this official publication compiled by the CCP Central Office of Documentary Research. The reason why those speeches are not collected seems to be that some of Liu's speeches during this period were clearly advocating reckless policies and practices of the Great Leap Forward. Now, I have never worked in the heavy metal industry, apart from scraping rust and doing some welding in a car mechanics shop. So the only thing I can say about overtaking Britain in 2 or 3 years is that it sounds impossible, no matter how many tens of millions move to the city out of their own free will or encouraged by ready-made migrations programs. Again, I'm in no position to say anything about how looming the end times felt at that time for these participants. But if we look at the predictions in agriculture, we can see that the exaggeration, such as 10,000 yin yield of rice per mu of land, so as to boost morale on the one hand and to show performance achievements on the other, was also cooked up by local authorities, encouraged not by Mao, but by other senior leaders. To help you think here, 10,000 yin is 5,000 kilo, and there are 6 mu per acre. However, on a quarter acre, which would be more than a sixth, thank you very much, I do remember my fractions. With natural farming, if you are good and you know what you are doing, timing is right, etc., and you want to match conventional standards expected with chemicals today, you would get about 500 to 600 kilos of rice, or 700 liters, or 20 bushels, let's say. So 10 times that on a sixth of an acre is not only impossible, everybody who has spent their life farming would know it is impossible, thus again highlighting the quasi-religious expectations regarding what had to be done not to be nuked off this earth. The party secretary of Guangdong province, Tao Zhu, for instance, published an article in the CCP's theoretical journal The Red Flag on July 15, 1958, titled, quote, "Refuting the theory that there was a limit to the increase of grain production," end of quote. The then Vice Premier and Foreign Minister Marshal Chen Yi declared that he had seen with his own eyes that in Panyu County of Guangdong Province, the yield of 1 million yen of sweet potatoes, 60,000 yin of sugar cane, and 50,000 yin of rice per mu. Again, 25,000 kilos is not only impossible, but something disturbingly different from mere exaggeration is going on here. If you want to think it's fear of one's superiors, be my guest. But my compassionate reading is that farmers were breaking their heads and brains with hope and belief that they would be the first generation in 150 years who would not have to see their country and children raped and pillaged by imperial forces. But maybe that's just me. Faith in the general line is important for any nation or social formation throughout history. People taking advantage of this faith, however, be they outsourcers of the NHS, the non-official officials who backstabbed Yanis Varoufakis in Greece, corporate grifter billionaires who greenwashed their commodities, or big pharma allocating resources away from research, well, they should of course be condemned. Odd then that Mr. Xiaoping, or Deng the Gnome, as he is known among hairdressers and others in China, is so loved by the authors in the West when he, as one of the main leaders responsible for implementing CCP policies, went as far as to stand happily on top of rice crops to indicate an extraordinary harvest, which in fact was the rice crops assembled from other fields and replanted on the one spot. In one of his random talks, Mao actually demolished Liu and Deng for going too fast and for being too rash, The talk, which took place on November 21st, 1958 in Wuhan, has not been included in the officially sanctioned selected works of Mao, but can be seen in Mao's manuscripts published in 1968. To Liu Shaoqi and Peng Zhen, Mao warned sternly that if industrial targets were set too high, there might be problems in agriculture to the point of many millions of people dying of hunger. When instructing Deng Xiaoping to replace Wu Zhipu, one of the most radical leaders at the time, to coordinate the draft outline for socialist construction, Mao told Deng that the length of time to complete planned projects should be 15 years instead of 10, which also gives a lot more room for rational thinking than the alarming imminence of 2 or 3 years we saw before. Another interesting thing is that in 1961, Peng Zhen set up a confidential investigative team to examine CCP Central Committee documents and media reports to find out what was said or reported that led the GLF astray. To be represented at the 1962 conference attended by the 7,000 CCP cadres and leaders. Much later, during the Cultural Revolution, at what was called the Changguanlou Black Meetings, these investigative meetings were presented as evidence of anti-Mao activities carried out by Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, and Peng Zhen. Again, much later in 2016, in his memoirs, Qi Benyu, once the deputy editor-in-chief of the Red Flag magazine mentioned above, said that the aim of those investigations was indeed to find faults with Mao, but that they had failed to find anything. Much of the politico-social connections, the camps, the factions, and the cliques that would fight each other during the Cultural Revolution within the army and within the party were formed during the Great Leap Forward, or rather in the immediate aftermath as people started covering or outing each other for their policy responsibility in some of the experiments. Instead of analyzing policy and organizational failures, such as overly large communes that led to supervision failure, information failure, as well as the difficulty of knowing what was actually happening on the ground in time to address the problems before it was too late, and mass movements actions driven by political passion for experimentation, the anti-Maoists in China and the Western recruited intellectuals focuses on isolated facts during the GLF, such as some houses being dismantled for the purpose of collecting fertile soil in some places, and violence against villagers by some local official thugs. Then they present these as giving a general picture of the whole period, or indeed the essence of communism. The truth of the matter, in a way, as counterintuitive as it might sound to our liberal minds, is that there was too much freedom at a time socially and materially unready for that aspiration. That is, it was caught up in a contradiction of people exploiting and taking advantage of the passion of freedom. As Edward Snow of the cult classic Red Star Over China put it in his 1972 The Long Revolution, quote, "And yet when I asked a very high official the direct question, who did the final push that launched the communes, his answer was, the peasant masses started them. The party followed." End of quote. Misrepresenting or outright lying about the Maoist era has become such lucrative business in the Western publishing world, and such political correctness in China up until Xi Jinping, that even the summary of our beloved CIA casts one of the better lights on the event that is our subject matter. In a declassified document, the photocopies of which I found after many sleepless nights preparing this episode on the Chinese 50s, roaming the wasteland that is the shut-down Maoist homepages gone to rest in the catacombs of the revisionist internet necropolis. Quote, "Widespread famine does not seem to appear at hand, but in many provinces many people are on a bare subsistence diet, and the bitterest suffering lies immediately before June, when the first 1961 crops will be harvested. There has been no localized mass starvation of the sort traditional in China." CIA, 1961. It is also interesting to see how the CIA interpret the cause and the course of the GLF. Quote, as a result of 2 successive years of poor harvests, the withdrawal of the Soviet technicians and the dislocation created by the leap forward, the country's leaders have been forced sharply to slow down the pace of the country's economic development program. End of quote. El Niño droughts and mass migration to prepare the industry for all-out atomic war, you say? Well, if the intelligence gathering agents of the CIA and their partners from, we might assume, the British in Smacktown, Hong Kong and the KMT in Taiwan, found no sign of famine by 1961, perhaps it's time to return to our analysis of the data and the registered deaths. I will post the intelligence documents on the Patreon, but to be honest, dear listener, one shouldn't have to need to see them. Because if one actually thinks about it, of course no country on this planet, no matter how big, can suffer a famine of 20 to 50 million dead without anyone knowing about it until some 30 years later. I mean, in British India of 1877, which unlike China was a de facto police colony, emphasizing above all else high security, according to the official allocation of expenditure. When poor harvests and high prices in England during 1876 to 1877 generated a demand that absorbed most of the Madras and Bombay wheat surplus, and 6 to 10 million Indians perished in the worst possible agony, the Great White Queen could only successfully keep a lid on the disaster until February of 1878. I'm not an avid supporter of Xi Jinping on every hill, but the fact that Sun Jingshan's statistical reading from the last episode can even be published is a sign that things have changed quite dramatically in favor of Mao the last 10 years. One of the most interesting developments concerns the three major professional critics of our previous analysis. Jiang Shenghua, director of the Institute of Demographic Research at Xi'an Jiaotong University, Yang Jisheng, who is the author of the book Tombstone, one of the biggest publications on the GLF in China. He was for many years deputy chief editor of Yanghuang Chunqiu, a magazine well known for its anti-Mao and anti-revolution stance, as well as Professor Cao Chu-ji at the Department of History at Shanghai Jiaotong University, who concludes that the total number of premature deaths during the GLF was 32.458 million. He couldn't say 450, that would sound like that he's lying. By 2020, according to Sun Jiangshan, all three of them have begun an quote-unquote ostrich policy. He writes, quote, "Obviously, if the three of them are still serious scholars, they should respond publicly to our academic criticism in the spirit of being responsible for history. If our academic criticism is wrong, they should obviously reply publicly to refute our mistake. In order to maintain the seriousness and scientific nature of academic research, and at the same time maintain their own academic reputation. If their research is wrong, serious scholars should also publicly admit their mistakes. From this perspective, they have adopted an ostrich policy against our academic criticism for several years, which is obviously not the attitude that serious academic workers should have. Their ostrich policy effectively announced that they had lost confidence in their own research, lost the ability to justify, which in fact also declared the bankruptcy of the 30 million people starved to death thesis." End of quote. Now, if the common sense that we who became adults after the second millennia have been interpolated with is indeed bankrupt, as Jingshan puts it, then we must tackle the final set of statistics so we can get some death toll bearings before we can finally meet the best-selling author Jung Chang in the battle for China's past. Let us commence. China's gross mortality rate in 1949 was 20 pro mil and 10.8 pro mil in 1957, which means that within merely 8 years that rate had astonishingly declined almost by half on paper, while the same reduction took 30 years by the world's average speed. The marks of the Asian and Middle Eastern countries recorded, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Iran, South Korea, Pakistan, the Philippines, Thailand, Turkey, and Egypt, reached no further than 15.3 to 17 pro mil in those 8 years. Given that China is the world's most populous country and its mortality reduction should show more inertia than others, apparently the existing statistics of its mortality rate in that period was incredibly low, or the decline of that rate was too fast to be credible. The explanation of these extraordinary figures can be found precisely in the major shift in China's household registration system, discussed in the previous episode. That is, since that system had not been rigorously operational until 1958, there was a serious underreporting of deaths all over, but mainly in rural areas. The actual mortality rate between 1949 and 1957, especially 53 to 57, could not be as low as what was recorded. The mortality rate of the same period should be adjusted upward. In the 1950s, the government conducted 2 sampling surveys, which confirmed the latter findings of Jingshan and his research team. The estimation of the rate of underreported deaths is 17.65% in 1953 and 16.34% in 1957. The actual mortality rates should therefore be adjusted accordingly. Based on the adjusted mortality rate, they worked out that between the first national census in 1953 and the end of 1958, underreported deaths were about 7.5 million in total. Further analysis allows us to also note that among the estimated 7.5 million of underreported deaths, about 6.75 million were cleared during the famine years by deregistration from the Hukou records. This correspondingly created a false increase of deaths in the same number of 6.75 million. During those 3 years, 3 years of hardship, the total number of registered deaths was 36.02 million. This number should be deduced by 6.75 million. The actual mortality of the period would then be 29.27 million 1959 to 1961. We could thus make statistical adjustments accordingly, something which is known in the scientific literature as a, quote, superlinear death toll, end of quote. Then using the adjusted mortality rate of 1957 as the baseline. The research team made use of this method and then cross-checked the final number with over 600 counties where the death rate during this period was the highest, which verified their estimated figures. They came to a death toll due to starvation and nutritional related deaths to be about 2.5 million in 2016, and later they increased that figure to 3.66 million. As Jingshan and others who have written about the research put it, the 3 years of hardship were the result of both natural disasters and human failings, and there are indeed historical lessons to be learned here. However, to partially and groundlessly exaggerate the number of deaths is not a scientific approach and cannot contribute to learning from historical experiences in order to march ahead more determinedly today. Obviously, this call to agricultural research is what this Biological Peace and Warfare series is about. So if we were to quickly return then to the most publicized groundless exaggerator, Jung Chang, we might find a fitting end to this episode. Though her printed copies fall short in comparison to the Little Red Book, which is up there with the Bible in the billion bracket, a close race to the end of time, I guess, her Wild Swans has still sold some 10 millions of copies since the 90s. That book, which deals with the life of 3 women, begins with her grandmother, the wife of a proto-fascist warlord, Chang's grandfather, as mentioned above, a man who fought and brokered deals with the compatriots of his class until the Kuomintang tried to unify them into a more coherent, terrorizing force fit for its time. Fighting fire with fire is seldomly the best approach, but with those numbers, 2.5 million to 3.5 million, fresh in our mind, we should recall that they are less than half, or maybe even less than a third, of the possible 10 millions who died of famine, estimated by professors at Stanford and Vermont University during the family's rise to political power and economic fortune. And with people like grandfather Xue Zhiheng, one doesn't need to make use of a pseudo-deconstructional method that might reveal that, well, actually Mao hates peasants, even though he is a peasant. Because the bling-bling sable-carrying warlords are proud of hating lower-class people and think it's strategic to once in a while remind the masses of their disposability. Beyond morbid statistics, it is a highly interesting period which deserves its own episode. Maybe even the next episode. I'm in charge, after all, I guess. But for now, let's try to focus on one last misunderstood topic of our next author, whose work is an important indicator of a millennial turn in how disinformation projects are carried out in the new era. Because as I alluded to earlier, if you have fans like Hillary Clinton and Oprah, and worldwide commercial media success, it doesn't matter much that most professional commentary has been disapproving. I mean, how skewed and how distorted have the simulacrum of the sales-hungry anti-communist authors and the apparatus they work for become, when the patron saint of that very machinery, Henry, Heinz, Alfred, will he ever kick the bucket, Kissinger, writes of your work that it is, quote, grotesque, in that it depicts Mao as a man without any qualities, end of quote. The 800-page book in question, Mao, The Unknown Story, was published in June 2005, 1 year after the CIA documents from the 60s were declassified in June 2004. Whether that is a mere coincidence, I don't know, but what we do know is that the declassified documents were not widely reported on, while The Unknown Story was mentioned in over 300 different newspapers in Canada, the US and the UK alone, in the year 2005 to 2006 alone, according to newspapers.com. According to Amazon's history book section, it's the most sold book about Mao and makes the top 10 on Chinese modern history in general, as far as I can tell. It tries to cover as much of the last century as possible. However, since we have yet to talk about it, it would be good to start at the Lushan Conference of 1959. To Jung Chang and her colleagues, the meeting was a scam designed by Mao to find a GLF scapegoat in Peng Dehuai, so he could have porky fat sex parties or something. I mean, something like that is what the Jung Chang says. I don't fucking know what she's on about, but anyway, the reality is a tad bit more complex. The Lushan Conference was held between July and August 1959. The original point of the meeting was to figure out what was going wrong with the GLF. Former head of the People's Daily, whom we have mentioned before and who was at the conference, writes that in June before the meeting, Mao underwent self-criticism to inspire others to do the same when they would all meet in Lushan. Wu confirms that during the Politburo meeting in Beijing on 12th to 13th of June 1959, Mao criticized himself for the recklessness of the Great Leap Forward policies and admitted that Chen Yun had been right after all to be cautious, which if anything was letting someone who should have been held accountable off the hook, since as we know from before, Chen Yun together with Deng Xiaoping and Li Fuchun were the ones who insisted on fulfilling the centrally planned industrial production targets. Wu further recalls that Mao's personal secretary, Tian Jiaying, was pleased that Mao made self-criticism and thought that it was then up to the party secretaries of various provinces to make self-criticism as well at the planned Lushan conference. Chen Yun, quoting Liu Chaoqi's speeches, argues that it was Liu who hunted Peng Dehuai down by accusing Peng of aiming to usurp power from the party. Liu specifically referred to Peng as a leading member of the Gao Gang and Rao Shu Shi anti-party clique, an accusation with which Zhou Enlai concurred. The anti-party clique refers to the event in 1955 when the Gao Gang and the Rao Shu Shi launched a campaign to reshuffle the CCP top leadership to replace Liu and his lieutenants. Liu also accused Peng of working with foreign influence, referring to Peng's visit to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe immediately before the Lushan conference. This makes the most sense in my opinion, since Liu certainly knew that he would move from number 2 to number 1 if Mao had already undergone self-criticism, but only if he himself avoided the praxis. And by linking Peng Dehuai with the Gao Gang and Rao Shu Shi, he would in a way kill 3 birds with 1 stone. Peng appears in this story since he had circulated a famous letter where he criticized some of the failings of the GLF and himself, while also praising some of the successes. When Peng's letter was circulated, Wu Lengqi, Hu Qiaomu, and Tian Jiaying, all comrades of Mao, who would go on to write similar criticism, questioning the efficacy and logic behind some of the policies of the Great Leap Forward, thought there was nothing particularly controversial about it, except for one single reference to bourgeoisie fanaticism. Peng's letter was not even as sharply critical of the Great Leap Forward as the conference resolution that the three of them had been instructed to draft. Furthermore, the story of Wu Lengxi, Hu Xiaomu, and Tian Jiaying is an interesting one, since Xiaomu and Lengxi were prosecuted in 1966 before the Cultural Revolution had really found its main course, and was later rehabilitated by Mao in the 70s. Hu Xiaomu would also later go on to criticize the liberal revisionism that took place after Mao's death. Tian Jiaying was found hanged in Mao's library under suspicious circumstances in that year, 1966. Hong Kong authors claim Mao was involved, though I suspect the story is a different one, since Mao had appointed this close comrade, also tutor of his children and personal daily secretary, to organize an investigation team in Hunan to understand the situation and problems in implementing the regulations on the work of rural people's communes, where he questioned in particular the statement about 10,000 jin of rice from 1 mu, which led to Deng the gnome standing on top of rice assembled in a single plot, discussed earlier. This all, of course, remains very murky territory of research. Having read the Peng Dehuai's letter, I agree with the three above that it seems to be the exact kind of criticism that Mao had been calling for a month earlier. In it, he writes, for example, quote, "Though Chairman Mao reminded the party last year of the need to combine soaring enthusiasm with a scientific approach and the principle of walking on 2 legs, it seems that his instructions have not been grasped by most leading comrades, and I am no exception." End of quote. The reference "walking on 2 legs" here was Mao's proverb for explaining the need of improving agriculture and industry side by side, and not letting the focus on one dominate the other. That the letter is not a full frontal attack on the project, nor an attempt at splitting the party, can be read out from the last passage. Quote, "So long as the whole party is united and works hard, the conditions for continuing the leap forward are present. The plans for this year and next, and for 4 more years, will surely be fulfilled successfully." End of quote. After a private conversation with Mao, Tian Jiaying was convinced that Mao was forced to agree to criticize Peng by the argument that if nothing was done, the revolutionary left might as well be disbanded. In an article from 2007 that has now been censored, Zhang Hengzhi goes even further. He argues that it was Liu Shaoqi and his lieutenants who encouraged the Great Leap radicalism, and Mao was the cautious one. But Mao was ready to shoulder the responsibility when the mistakes became obvious, since Mao did not want to damp the revolutionary spirit of the radicals. Zhang further argues, by quoting Liu Shaoqi, that Peng's letter was directed at Liu. The fight between Liu and Peng left Mao with little choice. Liu had only recently been made Mao's official successor, and if he sided with Peng, then the CCP would split. It was Liu who wanted to get rid of Peng, and it was Liu who said in 1961 that anyone could be rehabilitated except Peng. It was Liu who said that Peng, the Judas that he claimed he was, though in China the archetype is called Wei Yan, had a treacherous bone, and that he had the character of Chukov, suggesting, he was planning his own Khrushchev coup. Mao was drawn into the Peng affair reluctantly, and that was why Mao said on 24th of October 1966 that Deng Xiaoping had never come to seek advice from him since 1959, and that he was not happy with the August 1959 Lucian conference, because the outcome was pushed through entirely by Liu and Deng, and he was given no choice. We can see here again that the conflicts that would culminate during the Cultural Revolution and the revisionism that would take place in the 80s, which includes the release of the statistics, were already being established towards the end of the second 5-year plan. This thesis is backed up by Chang Su-hu, who in her book Changing Chessboard, What Happened During the 7,000 Participant Conference, points out that the eye pleaser Deng, once Peng Dehuai had been made the scapegoat, made an embarrassing, effusive defense speech of Mao, while he at the same time had been going around to different provincial leaders, especially Henan and Sichuan, the two of the three provinces worst hit by the famine, reassuring them that they would not have to take a fall during the Lushan conference. It is not difficult to see why he would be scheming like this, since if the top bosses were to be held responsible, Deng would certainly fall the hardest, because during the time in question, Deng headed the office of the General Secretariat of the CCP, that had carried out the day-to-day instructions of the CCP, and therefore was directly in charge of putting the Great Leap Forward policies into practice. What Deng believed and what had to be done must have made a great difference. For instance, on the 5th of September 1958, Deng's office issued a telephone conference decree instructing every level of party authorities to meet the quota targets for iron and steel production. The instruction was so specific and strict that the wording was Bu da yi dun bu neng shao, shao yi jin ye bu xing. Not a ton less of production is allowed, not even half a kilogram less. When Deng toured the Northeast in September 1958, he made several passionate and rousing speeches to encourage Great Leap Forward policies and to praise the newly established commune system. Finally, though Deng did not participate in the Lushan conference to attack Peng, he did publish an opinion piece in the CCP mouthpiece Red Flag, criticizing Peng and singing the praise of the Great Leap Forward policies. Such a little rat. Can't even face Peng at the conference, but he still has to out him in the magazine. Ay. The inner party struggles of the big party bosses, with Deng and Liu favoring centralization versus local administrators who sided with the Maoist line of decentralization, is of course not something Jung Chang pays attention to. But let's drop her now in the specific. We are nearing the end of today's episode, dear listener, so let's try to keep it even more interesting. One big question remains. Where did the original lie come from? In an interview at the Jinbu Wenhua, that is the progressive culture magazine, Sun Jingxian was asked this question. The interviewer first brought attention to another article that had raised some of my previous points in relation to de Koeter and his funding from the Taiwanese Changqingguo dissemination apparatus and its ties to the CIA. Rather than speculating upon de Koeter, Sun Jingxian went back to the roots and said that the original disinformation was published in a very short time after the statistics had been released. He answered the following, and I will paraphrase. Professor Ansley J. Cole, a professor at Princeton University in the United States, published The Rapid Changes in China's Population from 1952 to 1982. The book announced that there were about 27 million superlinear deaths in China between 1958 and 1963. The American Committee on Population and Demography could not just let such a book be published without anyone noticing, and held a press conference on July 10, 1984, especially for the publication of Cole's book. The United Press, the Associated Press, and other major news agencies in the West have all reported the above-mentioned superlinear death figures. Now, do you dare to guess, dear listener, who or which agency funded Professor Cole's demographic non-research ? Yeah, that's right. Long-time friend of the podcast and the forward movement of global corporate agriculture. The Rockefeller Foundation.
Alarm! 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 Achtung! Sie greifen an! Granate!
To make a final point, that one cannot just find an abnormality in a set of statistics and then claim that they are caused by man-made famine. I would like to draw your attention to an RT article that went somewhat viral a few years back, which suggested that about 8 million people died during the Great Depression in America. The articles have been reposted on various blogs and sites, and I went around looking at some of them and found some curious things. On some sites, people were led to believe what was put forward in the article and had some questions about their own nation's integrity, posting shocking stories from relatives who were alive at the time. I don't know how many of those were internet conscripts, because on every repost of the article on the web that I could find, I also found the exact same copy and paste debunking under different names. All in all, I view it as nothing more than a low-key battle of the American and Russian troll armies. However, the possible motivation behind the article, I think, was the most interesting. Some commentators were seriously triggered and started saying that no, 0 people died of starvation during the Great Depression, which is also the semi-official analysis given by many of the popular macroeconomic libertarian, liberal, and gold standard conservative think tanks. I doubt that number as well, of course, but however, I think, just like some others, that the article was a satire. It was so sloppy put together that I don't even think RT seriously thought it was going to rewrite history. A newspaper which I, for the record, hold in as low regards as I do the Atlantic or the Washington Post. If satire, the author nonetheless had some interesting points. I think he successfully proved that if you work according to the same standards as the editors of the anti-communist posters, which we have discussed in these episodes, who often also have a thing or two to say about the agricultural collectivization in Ukraine in preparation for the fascist World War, then one would be forced to believe that some 8 million died during the Great Depression in the US, since according to the official Census Bureau report, which I downloaded, the summary of population growth for the 1930 to the 40s period in comparison to the previous decade, we see that the number drops for the first time in the statistics history, and down to a level it had not been since the 1860s and 1870s. The real reason for this, of course, involves similar parameters that we have discussed before, namely problems with in and out migration, and even international in and out migration, which wasn't a factor in China, as well as other factors such as the absence of childbearing, which, for example, Jung Chan makes great use of in pushing up her number. That is, that unborn children are accounted for as murdered by a famine. Maybe this is some Christian notion on the sanctity of life that I don't understand, but it is nonetheless a shitty reading of the statistics, which is what the satirical article tried to point out, or at least that's what I and some other commentators on the internet read from it. It is now time for me to make a more encouraging exit, one of dreams and less cynicism. But first I want to give a massive thanks to all the old and the new Patreons. You are awesome. Thank you so much. I hope that some more of you, dear listeners, will decide that you can help support me over there so that I can keep making this show. After all, this is not a low-effort commentary podcast, but a project that really demands a lot of research. And it has become a full-time occupation, reading Chinese blogs, original source material, books, diaries, watching documentaries, editing and recording, making album covers, etc. Even though it does not pay as well, it is a lot more fun than writing academic articles that no one will read. And true to my word, I have, as you can tell, started making double and triple length episodes rather than putting some of it behind a paywall. If you think that's the way to do it, then I kindly ask for your support. In summary then, I think, and I have already alluded to this before, that the Great Leap Forward can only be understood by also taking into account the general line of medium-scale local industrial and agricultural projects and decentralization, which were perfected and implemented with success in the decades after the 3 years of hardship. By the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1979, There were nearly 800,000 industrial enterprises scattered in villages and small towns, plus almost 90,000 small hydroelectric stations. These enterprises employed near 25 million workers and produced an estimated 15% of the national industrial output. This development provided the critical preconditions for the rapid growth of township and village enterprises in the post-Mao reform period. Of course, the true value of this project cannot be accounted for by GDP mumbo-jumbo, since the worth of free education, healthcare, culture, housing, in short, free living, and the security that comes with such living is literally incredible. Collectivization, decentralization, and the second flying leap forward proves that what one is tempted to call permaculture Maoism actually functions. Remember, there has not been starvation in the People's Republic ever since the end of the 50s. While in India, which is of comparable agricultural land size and population, where bourgeois liberal democracy reigns supreme, according to Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences winner Amartya Sen, one could argue that compared with China's rapid increase of life expectancy in the Mao era, the capitalist experiment in India could be said to have caused an extra 4 million deaths a year since India's independence. Yet when the Indian farmers organized the biggest demonstrations in world history, one after the other, there is no praise, no tank man icons, no rat lines for the dissidents. If there is mention, even when protesters are shot at with attack choppers, it is the peasants who are condemned for not accepting the standards of modernization. Many of those peasants and the Indian rebels in Dandarakanya knows that in a better world there would be plenty more books and instructions on that aforementioned success, fit for a politically motivated, undernourished rural countryside worldwide. The old-timers in China recall that for a short period of time in modern history, there were no biker gangs, no countryside mafiosos, no international cartels of mono cash crops or banana republic security forces. There was no drafts to leave the family farm and go off to imperialist wars. What there was a People's Liberation Army of young women and men and the non-binary, temporarily at ease under a nuclear umbrella, with the objective of organizing agricultural collectives, supplied by that local-scale industry, non-patent strong heirloom seeds, and relative low-tech solutions to the energy demands of their operations. Granted, there were things lacking in some places. On the cultural level, even though there was a lot of work to improve the livelihood of women, there might not yet have been a consciousness of the real problem faced by many women, LGBTQ+, and other marginalized peoples. On the practical, ecology was often a direct consequence of underdevelopment, but not yet the conscious incentive we now find to be absolutely necessary. However, I still know that in the manuals of the CCP archives, the biggest in the world, and in the memory of still breathing people, there lies the answer of tried and tested methods on how to organize the impossible before it's too late. Step-by-step instructions on how to live sustainably in groups of a handful of hundreds or a few thousands. Close to the land and close to life itself. It is compatible with, but cannot depend solely on petty market farming, homestead living, and organic solutions for the privileged stockers of the high-end restaurants in the city. It did not mimic the primitiveness of the proto-classless that was our life for hundreds of thousands of years. It was a new normal that allowed individuals to become real people together.